Posted by you/LucasD88. Truck drivers, what's a creepy story you've got from the middle of nowhere? Not sure if this story is creepy, but it's scary. My father was a truck driver in East Africa in the 80s and early 90s. During the years leading up to the Rwandan genocide, my father was passing through Rwanda. He reached a checkpoint and was forcibly removed from his truck at gunpoint. He looked like he belonged to the Tutsi tribe and they put him in a cage with other Tutsi prisoners. He tried communicating that he isn't Rwandan, but no one spoke the same language as him. Every night they would take about 5 people from the cage and slaughter them in front of him. After the third night, he saw a man that spoke a little bit of Swahili, which my dad spoke, and told him that he's not Rwandan and showed him his ID. Somehow that guy got him out and he was handed the keys to his truck and was on his way. I was driving through eastern Washington on some state roads. There were no rest stops or cities, but I had done the route enough to know there were these massive dirt areas every 40 miles where you could park safely away from the road. I decided to call it a night and closed my blinds and laid down to watch something on my phone. After roughly an hour I hear someone try to open the driver's side door. I haven't heard any vehicles on the road the whole time I'm parked, but I get up to peek out the curtains. As I'm looking out into the blackness of the driver's side window I hear them try the passenger side door. I peek down from the top of the curtain but can't see anything, so I start the truck and kick on the lights. I'm fairly freaked out at this point, so I'm still not opening the curtains but peeking through gaps. Nothing. Nobody is standing near either of my doors or parked within sight line. I take a deep breath and close the sleeper curtains too, because for some reason that's going to make things better, right? After laying back down and convincing myself that something blew against the truck and it only sounded like the doors, it was fairly windy outside and a lot of flat ground, I hear what sounds like someone trying to pry open the vents on the sleeper. The door handles start clicking again and the truck starts shifting like someone is climbing on it. I hit the little alarm button in the sleeper hoping to spook them off, but it does nothing but add to the noise of door handles, fingers tapping on windows and chassis, and the hiss of air coming out of the suspension. Then suddenly it stops. A few moments where I can only hear myself breathing and my heart pounding before I hear another truck approach and then drive by. I spent the next few hours waiting for whatever it was to come back, but it never did. In the morning, I couldn't find any footprints or damage to my truck, but on every window were tiny human-looking handprints, like a toddler had licked their hand and stuck it to my window over and over. Driving through an abandoned section of Baltimore at 3 in the morning, my CB radio turned itself on and crackled for a bit. Out of nowhere, some voice over the radio said in a deep southern drawl, "I ain't got no panties on." I could see up and down the interstate for miles and saw not one set of headlights. My dad drove a truck between Edinburgh and London and tells this story often. He was driving down the motorway and looked to his right, and saw a woman with a Miss Trunchbull bun, as he describes it, staring at him with a terrified expression from a car next to him. Before he knows how to reach the car, pulls off at the next exit, and my dad, although shaken, carries on. About half an hour later, a different car with a different driver pulls alongside my dad, with the same woman in the passenger seat, with the same expression on her face. My dad thinks fuck this and plans to pull into the next services to report, as even if it's nothing/misunderstanding, better to be safe than sorry, right? Anyway, the car disappears before he can get any details, plates, etc., and he thinks there is no point calling the police with no details, so he carries on driving. About 4 hours later, almost in London, yet another car pulls alongside him with the same woman, same Miss Trunchbull hair, same terrified expression, except this time she appears to be screaming at my dad through the window, so my dad pulls over into a lay-by and calls the police. They have received 3 other calls about the same woman/car in the same area in the last few minutes. It is, unfortunately, anticlimactic, as he never heard anything more about it, but he didn't see her again, and although he kept an eye on the news, didn't see anything about it. Hopefully, it's just a giant coincidence. Who knows? Not a trucker, but I had a college teammate from Miami tell a story that he swears on to this day. He and his girlfriend were making the drive to Naples late at night, on a 2-lane road through the Everglades, and had been in a line of cars behind an 18-wheeler for multiple miles. She fell asleep and he was surfing for something to listen to on the radio. Only one station came in clearly enough to be tolerable, so he gave it a listen. The DJ came on and said something along the lines of "The stars are extra bright in the Everglades tonight. If you're driving through there, pull off and take a look." He said he normally wouldn't even think of it, but for some reason felt compelled to that night. He woke up his girlfriend. She was annoyed and didn't want to, but he convinced her it would be worth it. They stopped and just took in the stars for 5 to 10 minutes. He said it was the most amazing sky he's ever seen. They get back on the road and drive another few minutes and come across a massive accident. The truck they were following had jackknifed and took out a handful of vehicles that were following. He said there were multiple fatalities, but I've never been able to find a news story about it to confirm. Probably would have been in 2005-ish. They most likely would have been involved if not for that random DJ on the only radio station to come in that night. Not technically a truck driver, but I used to work as a field technician in the oil industry, so I spent a lot of time driving through remote areas of Canada at odd hours. One very strange and eerie experience sticks with me. I was in either northeast BC or northwest Alberta, can't remember the exact location, driving late at night when I noticed a very large black shape on the road in front of me. Thinking it was a moose, I stepped on the brakes, coming to a stop only a few feet from it. Despite being so close, and having my headlights shining directly on it, I still couldn't tell what I was looking at. It was vaguely the shape of a four-legged animal, but very big, probably about 6 feet tall. Aside from that, it was completely featureless. I couldn't make out any details whatsoever, no shine from its eyes, nothing. And then I noticed there were more of them in the ditch on both sides of the road. 5 or 6, or maybe more, all the same as the black shape on the road in front of me. None of them were moving. They didn't look like physical objects or living things. More like just large patches of absolute darkness. After I got over my shock, dread started to set in, and I drove around the thing on the road and sped off. I don't believe this was a paranormal experience. I had been driving for 8+ hours through the middle of the night, and I was exhausted. Most likely, it was a hallucination caused by lack of sleep and spending too long staring straight ahead into the dark. But it was still a very unsettling experience. Around 2006-ish I was driving a flatbed and picked up a load of construction material, drywall, roofing, don't remember, but it was prepackaged in boxes and I remember having to use strap protectors on the load, in rural Tennessee. Memory is foggy now, but I want to say it was between Memphis and Nashville, but closer to the intersection of the MS, L, TN state lines. Tarp required, so I strapped everything down, tarped the load, and left the shipper. About 5 miles down the road, in the middle of nowhere woods on a 2-lane road, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind. Found a wide shoulder and pulled over to fix it. I realized that I just flat did a shitty job tarping this load and decided to redo it on the side of the road. Undo all the bungee straps, drag the tarps off, roll them back up, climb up on the load and start unrolling the tarps again, and I see a guy walking down the same side of the road I'm on, coming towards my truck. I don't think anything about it other than to keep an eye on him cause I'm in the middle of nowhere and continue what I'm doing. About the time I have tarps set in place and am climbing down to start hooking the bungee straps back on, this dude is getting close enough that I'm now paying more attention to him than I am to tarping my load. I grab my winch bar and set it on the trailer where I'm working just in case. 8-pound solid metal bar about 4 feet long, tapered to a blunt point on one and hollow on the other, used for tightening straps and chains, etc. The guy gets to me and the first thing I notice is his hair. It's like a mullet, but it's patchy as fuck. Like he tried to cut his hair and had a seizure in the process and said fuck it good enough to party. The next thing I noticed was his eyes, which I can only describe as off. Like they were clear. I didn't think he was drunk or high or anything, but it also gave me the distinct impression that the elevator didn't go all the way up. Clothes were dirty and not well maintained, with dirty white tennis shoes, cause I remember he didn't have laces on one shoe and the tongue was noticeably out of place. He stops by me, waits until I acknowledge him, and just says I've got a long walk. I'm like, yeah man, you do, we're in the middle of nowhere. Making it clear there's no pride to be had here. He nods, starts walking by me, continuing on his way, stops at about the driver's door on my truck and turns around, comes back to me, and repeats himself. I've got a long walk. At this point, I explain that I can't give him a ride, insurance, and all that. Apologize for not being able to help him out, and he seems to accept this, turns around, and leaves. I wait for him to get a little ways away from my truck and start working on finishing the tarp job. I still keep an eye on him and he's moving away from me. As I'm putting on the last of the bungee straps, I look over to check where he's at and he's turned around heading back towards me, now about 100 yards in front of my truck and coming back my way. It looks like he's talking on a cell phone, has his hand up to his face and I can barely make out his mouth moving, his other hand waving like he's having a conversation with someone. I finish with the straps, grab my winch bar, and am climbing into my truck as he's about 10 yards away now. Soon as I'm in the cab, I lock the doors and set the winch bar on the passenger seat just in case. I look at the guy and realize he's not talking on a phone, he's talking to his fucking hand, and now I'm nervous, cause he doesn't look like he's having a nice pleasant chat, it looks more like an angry conversation. Crank the truck up, put it in gear and just pull out, didn't look for traffic or anything. As I pass him he's just looking at me, Still holding his hand to his face with this dead-ass look on his face just staring at me. Gave me the creeps. About the time I hit 5th or 6th gear I look in the mirror and there's no one there. I'm not a truck driver, but the story is from a truck driver. I was working the overnight shift from Friday night into Saturday morning at a gas station. At about 6 a.m. a semi pulls into the fuel aisle. The driver gets out and almost runs into the store shaken. His face is completely white and he is upset. My first thought was the poor man had hit someone on the road. We get a lot of drunks walking across a 4-lane of the highway in front of the store. So I ask what's wrong. He looks at me for a second and is like, I'm not crazy now. I'm thinking great, I'm here all alone and this guy is losing it. I say of course not. I just saw something huge on the side of the road. Like a deer or bear? We had a bear get in the dumpster last week. No bigger than a bear on its back legs. Maybe a big person? It picked up a dead buck on the side of the road and carried it over its shoulder into the woods. I can only stare at him. My brain cannot deal with this information this late in a shift. A local comes up to the counter to get his usual and the guy tells him the story. The local says, that's the Bigfoot that lives near the county line. The truck driver and I are both looking at this guy like he has two heads. He has to be joking. This trucker pays for his fuel at record speed and leaves never to be seen again. The local still insists it's the Bigfoot. I just don't get in the woods cause I don't know. Reposting my comment from another thread just like this. I work for a railroad. Not necessarily remote, but sometimes it's just a conductor and engineer cruising along ±10 miles per hour on the very isolated, fairly wooded track. I've heard a few older guys mention something about a family, or a man with a suitcase, something along those lines, doesn't remember, walking down the track with no concerns. Constant blowing of the horn, flashing of the lights, etc. Just kept walking down the track. Then disappearing. Near Weatherly, Pennsylvania. I also experienced a pretty intense trip myself one night coming home from New Jersey. Saw my first dead body laying along the rail, which in itself was kinda interesting. Then the only other part of my trip where we were required to run at a slow speed, I heard the craziest blood-curdling scream I have ever heard in my entire life. One of the nights I will probably remember until I retire. Not a truck driver, but I've spent the past 4 years driving every day/night for work. I was in a fairly rural part of Mississippi somewhere between Clarksdale and Greenwood. Important note, it's a 2-lane highway, the 250-mile drive home. The weather had turned pretty sour as I was leaving Clarksdale. I called my wife and told her there were high wind advisories and very possible tornado threats throughout the Delta, and I'd call her as soon as I made it to a safe area again. I had already been working for 14 hours when I got in the truck, so I ate dinner and grabbed some coffee to stay awake and alert. Now, if you've driven through flat farmland at night for 100 miles, it's very fatiguing and spooky. Without inclement weather, I had driven maybe 30 miles out into the farmland when the hail started bouncing off my truck. Being an MS native, I knew in July that hail meant a tornado. I pull off to the side. I'm in the middle of nowhere, no lights to be seen, no cars behind or in front of me, and start looking for the storm/tornado I believe is approaching. I rolled the passenger window down and shined a bright flashlight off into the night. Nothing there. Turned to the driver's side and this guy has his face pushed against the glass, grinning from ear to ear. I screamed and he was gone. I slammed the truck into drive and took off. We have all the time running cameras on our trucks. I got to the first safe place to stop and called my wife. I didn't want to scare her, so I didn't mention the guy or the hailstorm. I did, however, pull the SD card and check the cameras. I promise you this guy never popped up on my front or rear cameras. I've always played it off as my imagination. I will say I don't drive through the Delta in the dark anymore if I don't have to. Trucker here. I think the best creepy thing that ever happened to me as I was heading from Tucson, Arizona up into Salt Lake City, Utah. Well, this was a few years ago and the main highway had been taken out in a flash flood and was under construction, so I had to take a weird detour through the mountains in lower Utah. Well, it was getting late and I was getting tired, so I pulled off onto the shoulder and went to sleep in my bunk. Now, this was in the middle of nowhere. The closest town was like 40 miles away, so it is completely pitch black outside once I turn the lights off. Anyway, around 4 I wake up because I'm hearing something messing with my truck, like playing with the air and power cables between my cab and the trailer, which is 6 inches from where my head is at, but on the outside of the cab. Then I feel something climb onto the landing that's on the back of my truck and it shakes my whole truck, so I'm guessing something around 200 to 300 pounds was climbing around back there. I'm thinking like a mountain lion or a bear. At this point, I'm wide the F awake and I want to get this thing away from me, so I slam my hand into my cab wall trying to scare whatever is out there, slam hard enough to make it loud. I then hear someone, a male, scream bloody murder and I hear them fall off the back of my truck. I then hear about 15 other people all around my truck yelling. I climb up front, turn on my lights, and illuminate a squad of Army reserves doing their midnight ruck march and capture drills. Turns out these guys were supposed to go find an abandoned truck and secure it for their midnight drills. That truck was 3 miles back down the road. They were not expecting me to be sleeping there and thought I was part of the drill. I'm ex-military, so after explaining I was not part of their test and legit was just there out of coincidence, we laughed it off. They had to radio to their CO and tell him I was there and not have the other squads bother me. The obligatory not a truck driver but a second-hand story. I heard my great uncle drove big trucks and living in the middle of nowhere sometimes people would leave trash on the road. And since he had a big truck he'd just smash into said boxes or paper and continue. One day he was coming up on a cardboard box and just had the urge to swerve and miss this one. He misses it and passes by with no incident, looks in his rear view to look at the box, and out pops a kindergarten-age little kid. That just heads back to their house as if nothing happened. I've seen some rather screwed up stuff over the years. From bad wrecks, drug addicts, panhandlers, and more. There used to be a small rest area in North Dakota on US 52 at the intersection of ND 30 near Sikeston. I came out of the building after using the facilities and got ready to leave. As I was starting to pull out, a guy opened his car door. The angle was just right to see that he was buck naked. Then he gets out of his car and starts walking around the car. I'm not sure if he was a druggie, or just thought this is a good way to pick up a truck driver I've never met before. I just drove away and didn't look back. Maybe that isn't creepy in the sense that Op meant it, but I thought it was. One story that was creepy to me was that I was driving across Kansas on I-70 headed west. There is a pretty long stretch out there that's just a couple of little towns and not much else. As the night wore on, I realized I had been passed several times by this beat-up old motor home. Several people sat with their noses almost pressed to the window, watching me with creepy interest as they passed. Every time. And I never noticed where I repassed them at. A couple of times I swear they passed me twice where there were no rest areas, or exits to pull off at. I would have seen them stopped somewhere, but yet, here they were passing me again. They all looked like some variant of Charles Manson or some other freaky type. Had me pretty uptight by the time I got to the TA truck stop in Limon and stopped for the night. And almost every driver I know has seen stuff late at night that just can't be explained. Maybe it's fatigue, or maybe not. But I've seen very large man-like shadows cross the road way too fast for their size several times. I ain't saying it's a Bigfoot. Never got a clear view. Was always out at the end of the headlights where I couldn't be entirely sure I saw anything. But it sure looked like a large something crossing a whole road in just a couple of steps. Weird. As a crew guy of an off-road racing team in Baja California, Mexico, I got to test drive some rigs and trucks, so technically truck driver. We were driving down south along Sea of Cortez with a buddy at night at this 4-hour dirt road to Gonzaga, which is pretty much in the middle of fucking nowhere in the desert, and we see the lights of a car behind coming down fast and now effectively tailing us, and the bastard had bar mount headlights on top, or what seemed like it, which are super bright. It's normal, or was, that locals and gringos get wasted in the nearest, now former due COVID, spring breaker town and then go down this road super fast to test their rigs since there's no police there. So I try waving him off to get the guy to keep the lights low since he's blinding us, but he isn't slowing down a bit nor turning his roof lights off, and it was a dangerous super dark road. Finally, near a curve near the shore, I found a spot to bail off the road without crashing, and we see lights passing by us super fast and going straight to the curve, and we were like, that's it. He is going to crash down to the sea, but the lights didn't fall and kept going straight into the beach and the sea, and then pitched up abruptly to the night sky and disappeared. We didn't say a word for a minute or so, and then my buddy goes, "Did you see it?" And I say, "The fucking flying truck?" Didn't talk about it anymore, as simply it didn't make sense to talk about it, or with anyone else when we arrived. I posted this somewhere else recently, but it fits better here. I used to deliver hotshot freight across the Great Plains/Minnesota area. One night around 2 I was hauling across North Dakota trying to reach Montana by morning. I was delivering a particularly valuable tractor part that a farm desperately needed for the following day. I began to notice some highway hypnosis sneaking up on me, but it didn't bother me because I'd been through it hundreds of times before. Anyone who has driven across North Dakota knows that it is incredibly flat. Like, flat. There also tend to be very straight and long roads. It's somewhat easy to see things on the road that are far away, even at night. I noticed something long on the road, spanning my entire lane, approximately half a mile in front of me. I slowed down a little and prepared to move into the opposite lane, thinking it was some retread off a blown tire. As I got closer, I noticed it was two people, laying head to toe across the entire lane. I swerved into the other lane, successfully avoiding them, and came to an almost complete stop. But they didn't move. Not an inch. I was just about to back up and check on them when I remembered a story that an old graybeard colleague of mine told me. He told me that in certain remote areas, people will lie down in the middle of the road and wait for a car or truck to stop and see what's going on. At that point, the road layers along with whoever else are hiding in the nearby bushes will beat the shit out of the driver and steal his vehicle, leaving him in the middle of nowhere. I decided not to back up, and when the two people on the road saw me put my truck back in gear and drive away, they both got up and walked toward the shoulder. I called the police and explained what happened, but we were so far away from civilization that I doubt anything came of it. Thanks to that old graybeard, I got to keep my truck, my job, and my teeth. My father's told me this story maybe 1,000 times. My family, as well as a couple of uncles and my oldest cousin, went on a trip from Mexico City to Acapulco when I was barely a year old. Back home in the middle of the night, the good old days when you could travel at night, the car broke down, and a police car quickly came to our help. There were 3 policemen in the car, and the chief offered to take my dad to the nearest gas station, where he could find a mechanic, and told the other 2 officers to stay with our car. My dad says they seemed not pleased with the order until the chief told them, "Don't worry, there's a woman and 2 children." That seemed to calm the 2 officers. Driving to the gas station in the police car, my dad asked the chief what was all that about. The chief told him that there had been many accidents on that part of the road, that's why they were able to find our car so quickly. All of the accidents involved young men traveling without female or child company. Those who had survived said that they crashed because they could see a very beautiful woman next to the road, but once they came close to her, she turned out to be just a rotting corpse staring at them, and they crashed because they were paralyzed by fear.